On the night of October 14th, 1977, something happened on the Tonight Show stage that the people who witnessed it have never fully explained. Not in the decades of retrospective interviews that came later. Not in the memoirs, the documentaries, or the authorized biographies. What happened in those 4 minutes and 12 seconds has existed for nearly 50 years as a gap in the official record. A blank space where something enormous occurred, visible to 22 million people, confirmed by every person in that studio, and yet never spoken about completely, until now. What happened was this. Midway through The Tonight Show, during a standard celebrity interview, a man stood up from the guest chair without warning, reached across the table separating him from the host's desk, took Johnny Carson by the wrist, and stood him up. Then he walked him, firmly, without a word of explanation, behind the curtain at stage left. The cameras kept rolling because nobody told them to stop. The studio audience sat in 300 versions of the same frozen expression. Ed McMahon stared at an empty desk for 4 minutes and 12 seconds, his famous smile replaced by genuine alarm. Producers in the control room were shouting into headsets. And behind that curtain, in the narrow corridor between the stage and the dressing rooms, Johnny Carson and Jackie Gleason stood alone in the dark. Nobody heard what was said. Nobody knew what Gleason had seen in Carson's face 3 minutes before he grabbed his arm. Nobody knew what he had recognized. But here is what you need to understand before this story goes any further. Jackie Gleason was not an impulsive man. He was one of the most precisely calculating entertainers who ever lived. Every gesture had been measured and deployed with the accuracy of a surgeon. When Jackie Gleason did something unexpected, it was because he had thought about it very carefully, which means what he did that night was not an accident. It was a decision, and the reason behind that decision would change 22 million people's understanding of both men forever. Before we go any further, I want to say something. I often see comments from people who did not realize they were not subscribed. If you enjoy the channel, please take a second to check and make sure you are subscribed. It is free, and it really helps us keep the show growing. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. Now, let's talk about who Jackie Gleason really was. Because to understand what he saw in Johnny Carson's face that October night, you first have to understand what Jackie Gleason had seen in his own face for 50 years. Herbert John Gleason was born on February 26, 1916, in the Bushwick neighborhood of Brooklyn. He came from nothing in the most literal sense. His father abandoned the family when Jackie was 9 years old. Walked out one morning before school and never came back. No explanation, no goodbye. Just absence, sudden and complete, where a person had been. His older brother had died 2 years before that. His mother worked every job she could find until she died when Jackie was 19, leaving him entirely alone with $8, no diploma, and a decision to make. He chose entertainment, not because he had a plan, because the stage was the only place he had ever stood where the emptiness inside him went quiet. When an audience was laughing, Jackie Gleason felt temporarily like something other than a man who had been left behind by everyone who was supposed to stay. He worked bars, dance halls, touring productions, bit parts in films nobody saw. He slept on other people's floors. He borrowed money he couldn't repay. And then, in 1951, the honeymooners arrived. Ralph Cramden. The role that would define him, follow him, and eventually outgrow him, becoming something so large that Jackie Gleason, the man, sometimes seemed to disappear inside it entirely. By 1977, he was 61 years old. His professional legacy was enormous and settled. But the private Gleason, the one who existed between performances, was something else. Something quieter and more complicated. He had been married 3 times. He had navigated alcoholism for decades. He was a man who contained enormous vitality and enormous sorrow in the same body simultaneously, and who had spent a lifetime ensuring the vitality was visible and the sorrow was not. Which means he was an expert at spotting the same performance in someone else. You do not successfully hide something for 50 years without developing a precise understanding of what hiding looks like from the outside. But what nobody in that studio knew was that what he was about to recognize would force him to make the most unexpected decision of his public career. Now let's talk about what October of 1977 was actually like for Johnny Carson. Not the version 22 million people saw every night. The version that existed before the cameras went on and after they went off. Johnny Carson in October of 1977 was, by every external measure, at the summit of his profession. 15 years into hosting The Tonight Show. Undisputed king of late night. A cultural institution so embedded in American life that entire generations couldn't remember a time before him. He was the last face millions of Americans saw before sleep. He seemed from the outside like a man who had everything and knew it. But here is what that October was actually like. His second marriage had ended 5 years earlier. His third marriage was already showing the slow deterioration that comes not from catastrophe, but from the accumulation of 1,000 small absences. His relationship with his 3 sons was, by his own later admission, something closer to a formal arrangement than a family. His nightly routine after taping was solitary: dinner, usually alone. A drink, sometimes more than one. His housekeeper would later describe his apartment as the most immaculate and joyless place she had ever cleaned. Everything in its place. No clutter, no evidence of a life lived between the moments that mattered publicly, just surfaces, clean and empty. Johnny Carson was one of the loneliest men in America. He had been for years. And he was so good at concealing it that concealing it had become the thing he was best at. Better than the monologue, better than the interviews, better even than the timing that had made him famous. His greatest performance was the performance of being fine. But something had shifted in October of 1977. A hairline fracture in the composure that had never shown before. 2 people who worked closely with him that month would later use the exact same word without having coordinated their accounts. Flat. Not sad, just flat. As if whatever signal animated him from the inside had briefly dropped in strength. Not enough to affect the professional performance, but enough for someone who was looking for it. Enough for someone who had been maintaining that same gap between performance and reality since he was 9 years old. Wait. Because what happened that afternoon in the green room hallway is the detail that changes everything. Jackie Gleason arrived at NBC Studios in Burbank at 3:45 p.m., more than an hour before his call time. The stage manager noted it in the production log because it was unusual. Gleason went to the green room, ordered ginger ale, and sat while his manager talked about something he wasn't listening to. At approximately 4:10, he looked through the open doorway and saw Johnny Carson walking past in the corridor. Johnny was in his suit, reviewing note cards, moving with the brisk efficiency of a man who has a procedure for every hour of his workday. He looked, from a distance, exactly as he always looked. But Gleason set down his glass very slowly and watched him pass. What he saw was nothing a camera would have caught. It was in the particular set of Johnny's jaw, 2 degrees tighter than normal professional readiness. The way his eyes, visible for half a second through the doorway, were not focused on the cards they were looking at. He was looking at them the way a person looks at a wall. Seeing nothing because whatever was generating sight in him at that moment was pointed inward. Gleason had worn that expression for the better part of his adult life. He knew every variation of it. He knew what it cost. He knew what it meant when it was visible in a corridor at 4 in the afternoon, because by the time it was visible, it had been building for a long time. He thought about whether he was going to do anything about it. By 6:15, he had made up his mind. The show began at 5:30 p.m. Johnny's monologue was technically perfect. The jokes landed. The pauses were exactly right. But 2 camera operators independently described the same thing years later. A flatness behind the eyes. The particular look of a man performing a version of himself that he had been performing for so long, he could no longer feel the difference between the performance and the thing underneath. Ed McMahon noticed it too. He said afterward he couldn't have named it at the time. He just knew something was different. And he did nothing because on live television, doing nothing is usually the safest choice. But someone else had already decided not to do nothing. And what was about to happen had never happened in 15 years of this show. Jackie Gleason was introduced at 6:20 p.m. to the kind of reception that only legends receive. 300 people on their feet. Ed McMahon's voice cracking with genuine warmth. Gleason crossed the stage with that rolling, deliberate, utterly distinctive walk, settled into the guest chair. And for just one moment before the interview began, before the cameras found their angles and the machinery resumed, he looked at Johnny Carson the way a doctor looks at an X-ray. Quietly, precisely, without any expression at all. Then he smiled, and the interview began. It was a good interview. Gleason was funny. He told a story about a disastrous musical production in 1963 that had the audience in tears of laughter. The chemistry was real. Everything was working exactly as it was supposed to work. And then, 17 minutes in at 6:37 p.m., Jackie Gleason stopped mid-sentence. He had been telling a story about a golf course in Florida. The audience was leaning forward for the punchline. Johnny was smiling the real smile, slightly asymmetrical, the one that arrived a half-second before the performed version. Everything was perfectly calibrated for what was supposed to come next, and Gleason stopped and looked at Johnny. And the expression on his face changed so completely and so suddenly that the camera operator on camera 2, Gerald Foss, who had worked The Tonight Show for 9 years, said it was the most startling thing he had ever seen through a viewfinder. One moment Gleason was performing. The next moment he wasn't. And the difference between those two states was so absolute that Gerald Foss instinctively zoomed in without being directed to. What he saw through that lens was a man who had made a decision, fully and finally. Jackie Gleason stood up from the guest chair. Do not miss what is about to happen. Because what he was about to do had never been done in 15 years of this stage. The audience went quiet the way audiences do when something has no category. Not the silence of shock exactly. The silence of 300 people recognizing, without being able to name it, that something real is happening in front of them. Gleason walked around the low table, reached down and took Johnny Carson by the wrist. Gently but firmly, with the deliberateness of a man who has decided and is not going back, he stood Johnny up. Johnny rose with an expression of pure bewilderment, looked at the audience, looked at Ed McMahon, looked back at Gleason. He started to say something, and Gleason leaned close to his ear and said 2 words no microphone caught. Then Gleason began to walk, with Johnny's wrist still in his hand, toward the curtain at stage left, and Johnny went. That was the thing nobody watching could explain. He didn't resist. He didn't make a joke of it, which was his default response to everything unexpected on stage. He looked like a man who had just been told something that made resistance feel suddenly pointless. Like a man who had been seen and who was, in spite of everything, too tired to pretend he hadn't been. He walked with Gleason behind the curtain, and the curtain fell back into place, and the stage was empty. 4 minutes and 12 seconds. The cameras kept rolling. The floor director gave no instruction. Ed McMahon sat with his hands flat on his thighs and kept his expression as neutral as he could manage, which was not very neutral at all. The studio audience sat in a silence that moved in those 4 minutes, from confusion through discomfort, and into something that people who were there described later, when pressed, as a kind of reverence, without being able to explain why. Whatever was happening behind that curtain, it had weight. Everyone in the room could feel it. Here is what was happening behind that curtain. The corridor at stage left was narrow and dimly lit. It smelled of studio. There was a single folding chair against the wall and a row of cables along the baseboard. That was the space where one of the most important conversations in Johnny Carson's life took place. Gleason let go of his wrist. He looked at Johnny in the low light. Johnny looked back, still trying to locate the frame within which this situation made sense. He did what anyone who knew him would have predicted. He reached for a joke. Jackie, he said, I don't know if you noticed, but we're on television. Gleason didn't smile. He looked at Johnny with the same expression Gerald Foss had seen through the lens. The expression of a decision already made. When did you last sleep, Gleason said. Not last night, not 2 nights ago. When did you last sleep the kind where you wake up and something inside you is different from when you went to bed? Johnny's first instinct was to perform fine. He was so practiced at it that the performance started before the conscious choice had been made. I sleep fine, Jackie. Gleason let that sit for 1 second. Then he said the thing that Johnny Carson would describe, in a private conversation 12 years later, as the most precisely accurate thing anyone had ever said to him. You perform sleep, Gleason said. You lie down in the dark and you run the show in your head until it's morning. I know exactly what that looks like because I have been doing it for 40 years. Johnny said nothing. Do you know what I saw when you walked past the green room this afternoon? I saw a man doing a very good impression of a man who is fine. And I have been doing that impression my whole life, and I know every single tell. The corridor was quiet. Through the curtain behind them came the murmur of 300 people waiting. Jackie, Johnny said, his voice lower now, stripped of its professional register. We are in the middle of a broadcast. I know, Gleason said. That's why I had to do it this way. Because if I'd asked you in the green room, you'd have given me a very good answer, and none of it would have been true. And if I'd called you tomorrow, the answer would have been even better. He paused. So tell me right now in this hallway, where you don't have time to prepare, how bad is it? 8 seconds of silence. Johnny looked at the wall. He looked at the cables along the baseboard. And something in his face shifted in the way things shift when a structure that has been under pressure for a long time finally reaches its limit. Not a collapse, a settling, a small release of something held at cost for longer than it should have been held. Bad, Johnny said quietly, without preamble or softening. The word came out so unlike him that it seemed to take him by surprise as much as anyone. Gleason nodded. Like it has been for a long time and you don't tell anyone. Johnny looked at him. Yeah. And the performance is so good that nobody asks. Yeah, I know, Gleason said. I have been exactly where you were standing. He reached out and put one large hand on Johnny's shoulder, not as a performed gesture of warmth. The way people put hands on shoulders when they want to make certain what they say is received not just by the ears but by the entire body. You are not required to be fine. You understand me? Not here, not in this hallway, not in your apartment at 11 o'clock when the show is over and everyone has gone home. You are not required. Whatever you are carrying, you do not have to carry it alone. Johnny's eyes were wet. He was not going to cry. He was too defended for that. But the wetness was there. How long? Gleason said. A long time. Years? Yeah, years. Gleason nodded. He leaned against the wall with the ease of a large man who has learned to exist in small spaces. In 1949, he said, I was in a hotel room in Miami. I had been drinking for 3 days. Not because anything specific had happened. Nothing had happened, and nothing was going to happen. And I was 33 years old, still waiting for my life to be worth the trouble of living it. He paused. I had a decision to make. At first, then something small stopped me. Something as accidental as the sound of someone in the next room playing music. 45 seconds of music through a wall. That was all it was. Johnny was very still. I went 33 years before anyone looked at me and said what I am saying to you right now, Gleason continued. And those 33 years cost me things I am never getting back. My children when they were small. Marriages that didn't have to end the way they ended. Years spent performing a version of myself that didn't need anything from anyone, while everything I actually needed was sitting there waiting for me to stop performing long enough to pick it up. He looked directly at Johnny. I am not going to let you run at that same number for another 15 years, not if I can help it. What did you do? Johnny said, after the hotel room. Eventually I talked to someone, not right away. It took me 2 more years. But then I talked to someone, and it was the hardest thing I had ever done, and it was also the most important. He looked at Johnny. There is help available that is not as frightening as you think it is, and there are people in your life who would like to know you, the actual you, the one behind this. He gestured at Johnny's general presentation, if you gave them the chance. Johnny was quiet for a moment. His hands were still not entirely still at his sides. The sounds from beyond the curtain were the sounds of a room waiting, of an audience that had no script for what was happening and was simply sitting inside the uncertainty of it. And there was something in that collective patience that neither man acknowledged, but both of them could feel. I've been telling myself it isn't that serious, Johnny said, that everybody feels this way, that this is just what the job is. You performing long enough and the performing and the living start to look the same and eventually you stop worrying about which is which. Gleason looked at him steadily. Is that what you believe or is that what you tell yourself so you don't have to do anything about it? Johnny didn't answer, which was itself an answer. That's what I thought, Gleason said. And here is the thing nobody tells you when you are in the middle of it. The performing doesn't protect you. It just delays the accounting. And the longer you delay it, the higher the interest gets. What are you asking me to do? Stop pretending this isn't happening, Gleason said. Simply. That's all. You don't have to fix it tonight. You don't have to announce anything to anyone. You just have to stop pretending that you're fine. Start there. Silence. Then Johnny said the thing that Gleason would tell one other person about once, years later. I don't remember how, Johnny said. I have been doing this for so long that I genuinely don't remember what it feels like to not be performing it. Gleason looked at him for a moment. I know, he said. That's the thing nobody warns you about. He pushed himself off the wall and picked up Johnny's wrist again lightly this time, not with the grip of a decision, but with something closer to an offer. But you'll remember. He looked at Johnny with an expression that had no performance in it at all. Come on. We've been back here long enough. Your audience is worried. They walked back out onto the stage together. The moment the curtain parted, the studio erupted with the relief of 300 people who had been holding their breath without knowing it. Johnny sat behind his desk. Gleason settled into the guest chair, and for one moment both men simply looked at each other, not as a host and a guest, not as two professionals resuming their roles, with the look of two people who have just been honest in a way that cost something, and who both know what it cost, and who are, in their own way, at peace with it. Johnny turned to the camera. His voice had a roughness it didn't usually carry. Well, he said, I believe that is the first time in 15 years of this show that I have been removed from my own desk by my own guest. The audience laughed with the enormous cathartic energy of a room releasing what it had been holding. Gleason settled back with the unhurried ease of a man entirely at peace with what he had done. I've been wanting to do that since 1952, Gleason said. Just needed the right moment, more laughter. But something had shifted and everyone in that room could feel it. The quality of the remaining 15 minutes of that interview was different from anything The Tonight Show had produced before. The layer of performance was thinner, more permeable. The things being said were the same kinds of things said on any celebrity interview, but they were being said from a place closer to real. closer to the actual texture of two men who had decided for the remainder of this evening not to perform for each other. At the end of the interview, as Gleason stood to leave, he shook Johnny's hand and held it 1 second longer than necessary. "You know how to reach me," Gleason said, quiet enough that most microphones barely caught it. Johnny held his gaze. "Yeah, Jackie, I know. That was all. What happened in the months that followed, nobody announced. But the people who worked most closely with Johnny through the winter of 1977 described a change they could sense but not fully name. A slight loosening of something held very tightly for a very long time. He called his eldest son Kit on a Tuesday afternoon in November for no reason except to ask how he was doing. Kit would say, years later, that he sat with the phone in his hand afterward trying to understand what was different. He eventually decided that for the first time in his memory, his father had called not to be a father performing the role of a father, but to be a person who wanted to know how another person was doing. In early 1978, Johnny began seeing a therapist. He told almost no one. The work was slow. He was the most defended patient she had ever worked with. So skilled at examining things from a clinical distance that the examination could proceed for a long time without touching him directly. And then it started to touch him. And after that, she said, everything changed. He and Jackie Gleason spoke by phone several times through 1978, not on any schedule, with the particular consistency of two people who have established that the call will happen when it is needed rather than when it is convenient. Gleason was not interested in being anyone's therapist. He was interested in honesty. In the transaction that occurs when two people who have been performing fine their entire lives decide between themselves to stop. Jackie Gleason died on June 24, 1987. Colon cancer. He was 71 years old. The obituaries were enormous. The great one, Ralph Cramden, the entertainer who had defined an era. Not one of them mentioned October 14, 1977. Not the 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Not the corridor. Not the thing Gleason had seen in a hallway and decided to do something about. That was not the part of his legacy that was visible, but it was perhaps the most important part of it. Johnny received the news that morning at his Tonight Show office. He sat in his chair for a long time after his assistant left. He was quiet for the rest of that day. The show went on because it always went on, and he was technically perfect because he was always technically perfect, and nobody watching that broadcast would have known. But he was thinking about a narrow corridor, a folding chair against a wall, the sound of 300 people breathing on the other side of a curtain. He was thinking about the word bad, said quietly, without any performance around it, about what it had felt like to say it, about a large man who had reached across a table on live national television rather than watch the thing he recognized disappear. He kept a photograph on his desk for the rest of his life, a Polaroid slightly out of focus taken in the green room before a show in 1978. Both men in their suits, Gleason in mid-sentence, hands moving, and Johnny watching him with an expression that every person who ever saw the photographs described with the same word. Open. Not composing itself, not managing its own affect, just open. Just a person listening to another person. His housekeeper, the same woman who had described the apartment as immaculate and joyless, said the photograph appeared on the desk sometime in the summer of 1987 and was there every single day for the rest of the years she worked for him. She thought about what it meant that a man so careful about everything kept this blurry, crooked Polaroid instead of one of the professional photographs he could easily have it framed. She thought it was showing him something he needed to keep seeing, what he looked like when he had stopped performing and just been there. She was probably right. Johnny Carson retired from The Tonight Show in May of 1992. He lived 13 more years. His son said, in the statements they released after his death, that the man they had known in those last 13 years was present in a way the man they had grown up with had not been. Not the television version, not the composed, untouchable, perfectly timed public face. Just a person, imperfect and available in theirs. On his desk when his estate was settled, the Polaroid was still there. Jackie in mid-sentence, Johnny listening with his face open, and beside it a small piece of paper folded once. A date, October 14th, 1977, and underneath it 4 words in Johnny Carson's own hand. He saw me, stayed. Nobody who cataloged the estate knew what it referred to. They logged it as a personal note and moved on. But now you know. Now you know what happened behind that curtain. What Jackie Gleason saw in a green room hallway in the fall of 1977 and what he decided to do about it, and what it cost him and what it gave. Now you know about the 4 minutes and 12 seconds during which a television show held its breath, while something more important than television happened just off to the side of it. In the dark, where nobody was watching except the two people who needed to be there. The person who needed to hear the truth was sitting in front of millions, performing everything except the truth. And the person who recognized it made one quiet, irreversible, deeply human decision: to reach across the space between two people and take hold of something before it was lost. We don't talk about that kind of courage very often. We talk about the courage of visible actions, of public gestures, of things that can be photographed and replayed. The courage of the private act, the act that happens in a narrow corridor with no audience except the one person who needs it most, that kind of courage is harder to name, and it is rarely named. Jackie Gleason named it on October 14th, 1977, with the simplest possible action. He saw someone. He went to them. He told the truth. That is the whole story, and it is enough. If this moved you, do one thing before you close this video. Think of the person in your life who performs fine. The one whose impression is so complete that it has stopped occurring to anyone to ask what is behind it. Think about whether you have looked at them lately. Not at the performance, at the person underneath it. You don't need a television studio or 4 minutes of live national television. You just need to see them and then go to them and tell the truth. Because somewhere, right now, someone near you is performing fine, and they are very tired, and they are waiting for someone who knows what the performance looks like to say so. Be that person. Subscribe so you never miss these stories. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And drop a comment wherever in the world you are watching from. I want to know where the truth is landing. Where are you watching from? Tell us below. And if someone in your life has ever seen through your performance, if someone has ever taken you by the wrist and said the thing you needed to hear, tell us about them. Let's remember them here together.